Hi everyone, how are you? So as I promised on Monday, we keep on with the beach theme. So what you see behind me, this is it's called Whitehaven Beach. If you haven't been to Australia, this I've been there a long time ago. It looks not exactly like that. There's a very nice photoshopping for this picture, but it looks pretty close to that. It's on Fraser Island on the east coast of Australia, right by Queensland, which is a great place. So I just thought I'll add that. This is something which is both beach theme and a place that I actually visited, which you should too once the world comes back to normal. Anyway, a quick point before I start today talking about the extra credit. You had some of that information on the email that you received on Monday. So as I said on the email, the extra credit assignment is worth 3 points, 3 as in the number 3, which means that I'm asking, as I said on the lecture on Monday and as I said on the email, take this thing seriously, invest 5 to 10 minutes of your time during the day and do it properly so we can also use this information. So that's one thing. In terms of the time, I'm asking you, I sent you the link for the survey on Monday, so I'm giving you a whole week until next Monday, which is gonna be the date is gonna be the 13th of April. So it's gonna be the April 13th. That's gonna be the date where I want you to, by that date, I want you to finish with the survey with the extra credit assignment. Okay, so today we'll keep talking about counterterrorism. There's the slides for today. So on Monday, I've introduced the topic of counterterrorism methods, talked about the multiple ways that we can measure the methods that are used to fight terrorism, talking about the first conceptual challenges case, which is how to define success in order to later on assess effectiveness, whether it is the reduce in the number of attacks, whether it is prevent radicalization, destroy groups, stuff like that. Overall, the research, as I've shown you some of the findings, that most of the methods are not that effective. And then we started going to unpacking the different counterterrorism measures. The more general categories were hard versus soft, which we're going to continue today. And then we focus much more on hard power, which are different tangible tools intended to deter and impose costs. Most of them are mostly like a military type measures, the use of drones, the use of military forces and stuff like that. And then we further disaggregated the different methods. So some of them are more indiscriminate, such as repression and mass civilians, looking at the entire population. Anybody that has the potential to be a terrorist is actually might be the focus of those methods, or a more discriminate type methods, such as the use of leaders decapitation with drones. And then there's a lot of discussions about that regarding the legality of this method, the cost, and of course, all that comes back to the question of effectiveness. So today we'll keep talking about that. If you have any questions specific to Monday, as always, you're welcome to ask. The first slide is the same slide that I had also on Monday, discussing the different methods regarding power. So we talked Monday on hard power, tangible tools intended to deter and attack terrorists. An enemy-centric doctrine which focused on isolating and destroying the terror groups, and the different tools talked about drone strikes, military intervention, intelligence operations, and today we'll talk a little bit more about some of those methods, but the most focus of today will be the soft power, the indirect tools that are focusing on the underlying enabling causes of terrorism within the population, and the tools are intended to prevent radicalization, increase the capacity of integration of individuals into society, all of them intended to prevent individuals from supporting terror groups and joining them. So let's start with the issues of today. So the primary focus of soft power instruments is to highlight the benefits. If the hard power instruments are highlighting the cost and also potential providing potential benefits, but focusing on the cost of being a member of a terror group. In this case, we're looking at the benefits of abstaining from terrorism. Soft power instruments are not coercive, and they present rewards because the idea is to highlight the benefits, but at the same time, they can be punitive. They can have some kind of cost. And it takes a persuasion-based approach, which discusses simple measures such as political concessions, economic rewards, cultural influence, all those kinds of different measures, which I'm going to talk about now. So I will start by talking about soft power instruments focusing on the economy. So the strategy of economic influence is intended to focus on the limiting the flow of financial support for terror groups. The measures they used are focusing on operations by international organizations like the UN or members of the G7, the G9 countries, which establish standards that need to be followed by governments, by banking institutions, and by private firms. And those focus on countering money laundering, countering the freezing of financial assets for terror organizations, things like that. However, those kinds of measures involve substantial trade-offs. First of all, it restricts intelligence operations because of a lot of intelligence collections regarding counterterrorism is focusing on following the money trails. So once we impose more restrictions on following money, it makes it much harder to implement those kinds of intelligence operations to counter terrorism. It also has a cost for us as the civilians in terms of the financial industry as a whole. How much are we willing to sacrifice some of our ability to use the global financial system in order to stop terrorism? It also has effects, negative effects, in terms of supporting other methods of counterterrorism. For example, the transfer a remittance and money to a developing country in order to increase their resources for those weak countries which don't have the resources to fight terrorism. We are providing them with financial aid. If we're implementing those kinds of tools of more scrutiny of standards of transferring money, it's much harder to provide them with that kind of financial support, which again harms their ability to implement their own policies to fight terrorism. So that's one aspect of economic influence. Related to that is the use of diplomatic relations to exert pressure on countries that provide kind of a silent support for terror groups, so countering this passive sponsorship by states. The examples for that, so Spain was able to pressure the French and their support for the ETA group in northern Spain. And at the same time, the British had the ability to use their relationship with the United States to pressure them to halt their support for the IRA, which was, as I said a couple of times in past lectures, prevalent all the way through the beginning of the 2000s. And these actions had substantial effects on the operations of those groups, such as the IRA and ETA, and how effective they were. More specific cases, so for example, in 1987, the British were able to expose and then to stop the Libyan support for the IRA by having two insiders, which provided, were able to affect some of the shipments of arms from Libya to Ireland. So that's part of this countering state sponsorship in this sense. Moving away from economic influence to cultural and social influence. So, excuse me, this approach complements the use of hard power strategies and is focusing most and foremost on counter-radicalization, so preventing individuals from joining groups, preventing their radicalization process. This is focused around what's called CVE strategies. This is countering violent extremism strategies. These are non-coercive tools that are developed by community organizations, government partners, and again, they're targeting the radicalization process. They can include multiple actions. Those include portraying different messages, either media speeches or using online platforms. But overall, those are programs of engagement and outreach that are provide better integration within society. So let's give some of those examples. So this is a more specific type of action. It's called capacity building. Through more capacity within society, through youth and women's empowerment initiatives, community development, and different education, education of leaders, education of public workers, education of law enforcement agents. The broad objective of those kinds of programs is to include the cohesion within the community, includes the extent of trust by fostering interactions and multiple network opportunities across many different communities using government and social services. What those programs offer for those who are more likely to join the radicalization process is that they provide them opportunities to express their grievances through channels which are not violent channels. So they have non-violent political contention channels which they can express their grievances, and then they will not join the more violent type of channel through terror groups. They also help integrate former radicalized members of groups and offer them, again, a place to express their grievances and concerns in a non-violent settings. Whenever we talk about those kinds of policies, which are much larger in scale, in some examples, we think about the effectiveness. So the question of effectiveness is very, very complicated. It's very extremely difficult to evaluate from a systematic standpoint because it's very hard to identify measures which are general for different kinds of policies. There's a wide diversity of programs that are implemented within these soft power instruments that are focusing on the cultural and social influence. So because there's a lot of different programs, it's very hard to find measures which will be common to all those programs, so we can actually make a robust effectiveness test for how good are those programs. At the same time, there's some lessons we can think about. One of them from programs that has been implemented in Europe. There's a lot of these programs already implemented. Also in Canada, we saw some evidence for that in the video that we saw together early on this semester, and the second movie that I sent you last week. So there was this guy in Toronto, the former member of a terror group, which almost joined a terror group in Syria. He talked a lot about those different kind of programs, which have been implemented in Canada for quite a long time. So one of the main lessons is that we need to focus on a more individual type programs, individual interventions. They are more cost effective. They're much easier to evaluate because they're most specific, which means that we have to move away from all kinds of large-scale program. Those focus program necessitates identifying and recruiting competent and local leaders, and that comes in most cases at the expense of those national large-scale programs. And the evidence for success from Europe, and again, as I said, from the example in Canada, shows that those case-specific approaches can be successful. At the same time, there's some criticism in that. For example, in England, the Muslim community tend to highlight the risk of singling out the Muslim community as the ones who needs to be part of those kinds of programs, because in many cases, once you single out a very specific part of society as those are the members of society that needs to be part of those kinds of programs, it's very easy to move to a more hard power strategy such as mass surveillance on Muslims, because they are potentially going through the radicalization process and then joining terror groups. So there's also problems to that. The third category of soft power instruments is political influence. In this case, we're highlighting different conciliatory measures that are intended to alter the political context and overall make terrorism less appealing methods of political contention. The focus of those programs is, for example, focusing on the constituency of a terror group, so the members of society that are supporters of a terror group and the objective of those terror groups. We have to make material concessions or signal our intentions to bargain with the terror group, so we're actually changing the political context in which these members of the populations are facing, and then they're less likely to support the terror group in order to promote their own goals. This political influence can be either discriminate or indiscriminate. So discriminate, for example, some of the policies that are implemented in Israel and in Italy, which is providing benefits to terror group members that provide information, which allows to arrest and again, apprehend terrorists. So this is a more discriminate, focusing on members of the groups, providing them benefits. In this case, it's economic and political benefits that allows to fight terrorism. And there can be policies that are more indiscriminate and they target the entire population with the objective of incentivizing a large-scale shift in public opinion away from public support of violent extremism. So that's a political influence. Overall, when we're thinking about political influence or soft power instruments, one of the important mediating factors in this case is how the degree of trust between the population where those measures are implemented and the government. Unless the government can establish some kind of credibility based on a prolonged campaign of those kinds of action, the chances of success for those policies are very, very low. And besides those questions about trust and how likely they are to emerge, there's other types of skepticism when it comes to providing political benefits to those who are using violence. First, the argument that if we are negotiating with terrorists, those who are implementing violent methods of political contention, we're encouraging others to do the same thing. There's other issues regarding the moral hazard of rewarding the few who do not follow the rules and not rewarding those who have their own grievances, but they express those grievances in a non-violent method and do not get the benefits. So this is another problem with that. And the third point is the risk for stigmatizing an entire population, because a lot of those methods, as I gave the examples for the English example, tend to ignore variation within groups. So not all Muslims are potential for joining a terror group. But if we're looking at the entire Muslim community as those who has to be part of those kinds of programs, it's a problem. Another type of political strategy in this case is a more focused one on some level, and that is intended to shift the political context and deny benefits, not provide benefits to some members who are shifting away from terrorism, but actually denying the benefits from radical groups. And the example in this case is Spain, which was able to marginalize some of the more radical factions of ETA by signing a political pact with most of the parties in the Basque parliament, except those radical groups within ETA. And it was very effective in marginalizing those groups, and the extent of support that they got from the public and their ability to recruit financial resources and recruits was reduced as a result of this kind of policy. So that's, for example, for a very successful policy implemented by the Spanish government in this kind of context. So before we go a little bit more specific in terms of talking about those kinds of methods, I want to do more of a summary of counterterrorism instruments, and mostly focusing on the success measures and the effectiveness question. So one group that I talked about was the indiscriminate repressive actions. The vast majority of evidence shows that those kinds of measures tend to backfire. They're unlikely to be successful, and they create more support for terrorism and reduce the legitimacy of the state. So the American example with Al-Qaeda is one. The long protracted conflict between Israel and the different Palestinian groups is another example for that. And the large debate on mass surveillance here in the United States in the context of civil liberty, national security, and all those questions. So that's one group of policies, and what do we know about their effectiveness? Second is still remaining within the context of a hard power and military type policies. We're looking at discriminate strategies such as targeted killing. And this is very much context dependent. And the success is contingent on factors such as the structure of the terror groups. And it is a very important thing that we have to think about, whether those kinds of policies, which has a lot of cost, they have potential benefits, they will also have a lot of cost. How do we assess this cost benefit of using targeted killing as a discriminant strategy against terrorism within the overall counterterrorism effort? So that's another point. And then we shift, and today I talked mostly about soft power strategies. Those overall has a little bit more promise and potential, mostly because they emphasize the benefits of abstaining from terrorism and radicalization instead of focusing on the costs that are the main point of the hard power measures. There are problems, of course, with those kind of policies as well. There's political risk. It requires a high degree of mutual trust between the population where those policies are implemented and the government. And mostly those kinds of policies require a keen understanding of the political context that drives group members to join terrorism. So all of these are very important, and again, showing that those policies have potentially more promise, but they have their own set of limitations. Now I want to go into a little bit more of a in-depth discussion about probably the most prevalent counterterrorism methods of the last 10-15 years, which is the use of drones. Before that, I want to talk about today's attendance word. Today's attendance word is going to be a pillow, what we put our head on before we go to sleep. So that's the attendance word for today. All right, so I want to talk about the debate around the use of drones. I used for that a very recent study that was published in one of the high-ranking journals in international relations and political science. The authors of this paper addressed the use of drones in a very specific area, the drone campaign in North Pakistan, and want to evaluate mostly is the effectiveness of the use of drones, because that's the main question that we're trying to answer. So overall, the data that they're using and the time frame they're using, this is from the paper. As you can see, the number of drone strikes per month. So their data is from 2008 to 2012. This is a very specific area in Pakistan, in North Pakistan. I will talk about those different regions in a second. But as you can see, with the data that they're using, the number of strikes over that time frame overall was in increase in the use of drones. This was a substantial part of the Obama policy in Pakistan, overall his policy fighting terrorism. So all of those things are not coincidental, they're all related. So what they wanted to do is to expand the research question by expanding the application, by looking at the applications of the drones campaign beyond the very intuitive and basic way that we are familiar with when it comes to the use of drones. So they wanted to look at the use of drone not just for decapitation, what they term the kinetic effect, which means the killing the leaders and the members of the groups, but looking at drones as more of a multi-purpose tools, which means drones, especially in Pakistan, allow the Americans to continue continuous aerial surveillance of the area, to intercept a lot of the communications between members of groups, and to serve as a continuous processing of intelligence to build this bank of targets, which later can be attacked. So drones can be used for decapitation based on the building of this target bank. Those other purposes, or other usage of the drones, creates what's called anticipatory effects, which are how is that those kinds of so anticipatory effects are the different actions that the terrorists themselves are engaging in because they want to reduce the risk of becoming targets, mostly because the drones are used not just in order to kill them, but just to follow them all the time. So anticipatory effects in this case are actions such as restrict their own movement. So terrorists are moving less around the area where drones are used for that. Their communication are much more limited. And it also has an effect in terms of compromising higher degree of compromise the trust between different groups, because again, everyone are being followed all the time when drones are used in that way. So there's a lot less trust among different groups. So that's the way that they described this use of drones. So again, this is from their paper. So the figure that you see here on the left-hand side, this is an area, again, one of the regions in North Pakistan where they tested the effects of drones. As you can see, the 2008 line, and you can see the relatively low number of attacks by insurgents when drones were used for different actions beyond just killing of leaders. So all the other measures are top. And this is a comparable, this is the control regions, areas where drones were used mostly to attack leaders. And as you can see, the number of attacks in those regions are relatively much higher compared to that region. And there's a lot more different regions described in the paper. You can go back to the paper and look at that if you're interested in. So in terms of the finding, they found that the use of drones for multi-purpose operations decrease pretty significantly the extent of attacks per month, as well as the number of casualties. So in the previous slide, you saw the comparison of the number of attacks. So this is the slide for the number of casualties. And again, this NWA is not the rap group or the hip hop group from Oakland. This is a region in northern Pakistan. And this is the two other regions. And you can see the differences between the number of casualties, which is much lower here compared to those two regions. So those are their findings. They account for multiple attacks. I mean, in that case, this is the use of drones for a long time. So, and they show the negative effects that the drones had were not just a short-term reduction in the number of attacks as well as the number of casualties, but they were actually a long-term trend based on those anticipatory effects. So this is their support for this argument. When we're using drones beyond just focusing on targeting the leaders, they are positive and they are an effective tool of counterterrorism. To those findings, they add qualitative evidence that is based on interviews and communication seizes from the Bin Laden raid, which showed, again, that some of those terrorists were more concerned about communications between one another and moving around those areas because drones were implemented on that way. So their implications, so the implications that they are suggesting is that a multi-purpose drones provide much more benefits and are more effective than just using them for individual strikes. According to their discussion, it limits the ability of groups such as Al-Qaeda or the Pakistani Taliban, for the context of their paper, to engage in terror actions across that region. So again, in this region where drones were implemented on such methods, it had the positive effect. It was an effective counterterrorism measure. They also argued that it links the population-centric approach to the use of hard power tactics, which means that, again, the more the need to rely on a lot of human intelligence in order to stop those operations, unless, like they argue, the use of drones on that matter as a multi-purpose different operations allows to reduce the dependence on human intelligence because it provides, the drones provide this robust surveillance tool as part of the overall surveillance program to support offensive operations against terrorism. So that's another thing, another way that we can use drones. So that's the first paper that I want to talk about, and this is how can we use drones more effectively as part of the overall counterterrorism campaign. Related to that, drones are a substantial part of the debate among the public in the West, especially here in the US. So the use of drone highlighted the dilemma that I've mentioned a few times in the past, the effectiveness of counterterrorism tools to fight terrorism versus questions of values and norms in democratic society. So the first paper I want to talk in this context is this Krebs and Wallace paper. They conceptualized public opinion as based on what I've also mentioned in the past, a top-down mechanism. So government messages about the need to employ drones to deter terrorism. At the same time, there's other information sources that the public is exposed to. Some of them are from international organizations, which highlight international laws and international norms, which again are very important in a democratic society. So this is the question is the effect of those kinds of laws or organization on how much the public is likely to support the use of drones. So in essence, what they study in this paper is the tension between the international legal principles, which are, again, essential to democratic society, versus the effectiveness of tools such as drones in combating terrorism. They're using a survey experiment, and what they find overall is that the legal arguments that are raised by the international organization actually resonate better within the public as regarding their opinion about the use of drones than the military ones. So the push from arguments by international organizations have a stronger effect compared to the government statements that the use of drones is an effective way to counter terrorism. So what they, one of the conclusions they draw from that is that public rejection of the use of drones on some level is based on normative concerns much more than they are about how effective, from a military standpoint, are those tools. So again, normative concerns are important in the public's eyes, and they're part of this debate about the use of drones when we think about how the public views a government counterterrorism policy. So that's one aspect of it. The last paper that I want to talk about for today is related to we're going into deeper into the individual level and what drives our perception about the use of drones. So instead of looking at the government as the one that gives us the information, we're trying to understand more on the psychological level, psychology of threat perception, trying to understand what explains our support for drones as a counterterrorism tools. For that, I want to use the paper by Fisk and her associates from a couple of years ago. They introduced the role of negative emotions as driving support for the use of aggressive tools. There's a lot of previous research in political psychology and political science as a whole that negative emotions increase our support for the use of aggressive tools. In this case, the negative emotion that's most powerful is anger. The more angry we are, and this is evidence, we have a lot of evidence for that in previous studies, the more likely we are to support the use of more of an aggressive countermeasures for the source of the anger, which in our context is terrorism. So what they conceptualize is that anger is a powerful emotion that will increase the support for the use of drones facing a substantial terror threat. They use cross-national samples and experiments in the United States as well as France and Turkey in order to test this argument. And indeed, they find that these negative emotions of anger actually mediates the perception of the threats from terrorism and increase support for the drones usage. So those individuals that are more angry as a result of facing the threat of terrorism were actually more likely to support the use of drones. So this is part of this micro level, individual level mechanism, a psychological mechanism that explains why are members of the public actually more likely to support the use of drones as part of the counterterrorism campaign. So this is the end of the discussion about the different methods. How do we conceptualize? How do we measure the effectiveness is one of the main questions. On Friday, we'll talk a little bit more about the theoretical aspect, going back to some of the theoretical approaches and linking them to counterterrorism tools. I want to remind you the extra credit task that you had the email on Monday and that I've talked early on in this lecture. Send them, make sure that you complete the survey by Monday, so I'll be able to find your name in the list of respondents and then provide you with the extra credit. With that, I am done for today, and with the nice background of Whitehaven Beach in Eastern Australia, I will say to you goodbye.